I wanted to start with some comments here. You heard of Zogby? They do a lot of polling. Zogby had a poll not too long ago of college seniors, and 73% said the ethics instructions that they received was pluralistic. They were taught that what's right and wrong depends on individual values and cultural diversity.
Gee, where we heard that?
Yeah, not a surprise. Here's a New York professor. He studied his own students in a class. He discovered that 10 to 20% of them could not define the Nazi extermination of the Jews as wrong.
What?
10 to 20% said that we can't call it wrong. They said, well, they personally disliked the action, but they said you can't judge the Nazis because you're outside of their culture. So we'll cover some of that in a little bit. Stanley Fish, who's pretty well known, he's an extremely liberal guy, and he was talking about the terrorist acts of September 11th. He said he did not want to focus on moral wrongs of the acts, but to focus instead on the competing claims of both sides. He didn't want to deal with rights and wrongs. That bothered him to even use that language. So he'd just say, well, one side says this and one side says that. According to Barna's another pretty well-known pollster, the most common basis for moral decision-making among teens, all right, so we're talking teens, is, quote, doing whatever feels right or comfortable in a given situation.
That's a teenager.
Yeah. 84% of evangelicals in a recent poll said there are absolute standards of right and wrong. And they said, so what are those standards? And they said, it depends on your practical experience and common sense. Those are evangelicals. Oh man, that's so sad to hear that.
He's the only young man I know that says, this is right.
Here's a sign that was in a park. It isn't wrong to think you're right, but it isn't right to think others are wrong. What is it saying there? Can you translate that?
Anything goes.
Anything goes. So it's okay if you think you're right, but just don't impose or say anybody else ought to do something or what they're doing is not right. That's wrong to do that. I want to tell you a quick story here. I've got the essentially the dialogue of it. I don't have the whole details, but it comes from Greg Kokel's book that I think would be really helpful since we spent 2 weeks on this moral and ethical stuff. It's called Relativism. And then I like the subtitle, Feet Firmly Planted in Midair. What a great title. So he tells this story, and I'm going to share the story with you. He was at one time going to a doctor for some kind of therapy or something, and so a nurse came in to kind of prep him, get it ready for it, and for whatever it was. And they had enough time where they were just kind of, sitting there talking to each other. So he asked her, he said, hey, listen, I'm really interested in ethics and all. Do you mind answering a few questions? She said, no, that's fine. Now remember, this is a woman who's in a field that shows that she's a real sharp lady, right? So this is not just some derelict out on the street. This is a person who's got the education on. So he says, let me ask you something. Do you think morality is absolute? Steve talked about that last week. Or do you think all people decide for themselves? Or her answer makes you worry a little bit. She said, what do you mean by morality? He said, well, this is going to be a long conversation. He says, well, we're talking about what's right and what's wrong. She says, she wouldn't answer. And he said, man, I'm going to have to start by giving her an example because she seems confused about this whole general idea of morality. He says, okay, how about an example? Is murder wrong? Let's just take one situation. Is murder wrong? Is it wrong to take an innocent human life? Now, it seems like that would be pretty simple. And she said, well, pause. He said, well, could we say that taking innocent life, is that morally acceptable to do that? I guess it depends. So he says, depends on what? By the way, do you see what he's doing here? And we've talked about this before. He's asking questions. So he's not on the spot. I mean, he's just asking questions, and he'll take the conversation, depending on her answers, wherever it goes, trying to show her that what she's believing is probably not the greatest thing. So he asks, depends on what? She says, it depends on what other people think or decide. Oh, we're back to that again. Right? This is that culturally, whatever everybody says, that's what makes it right or wrong. So then Coco says, do you think torture, so he's going to come up with an even worse example to see if she'll finally land on something and say, yeah, that's wrong. So he says, all right, this is the one that a lot of people will use. I think Steve mentioned that last week. Do you think torturing babies for fun is wrong? Now, at that point, I mean, wouldn't you think this is a solid place for her to land? Well, I wouldn't want them to do that to my baby. He says that wasn't the question, what you like and what you don't like. The question is it wrong or is it right? He says, do you believe there's any circumstance, any time in history, any culture in which you could torture babies for fun and that'd be considered okay, that'd be justified? And she said, people should be allowed to decide for themselves. And so he said at that point, he just dropped it and went from there. But I mean, you see, she would not commit at all, just like 10 to 20% of the students would not commit to say that what the Nazis did to take 6 million innocent people and take them out, put them in camps, work some of them to death, and gas those that you immediately thought would not last too long. Do that to 6 million Jews, but you did it to gypsies, you did it to homosexuals, you did it to those that didn't agree with your politics, and 10 to 20% couldn't say that was wrong. That's where we are. That's our society is a morally confused society these days. So here's some of those questions I asked you. I sent a note out. I hope you're getting all my emails. Yesterday I sent one out. And I said, these are some issues that we can kick around here. What if we disagree about what's right and wrong? What gives you the right to force your views on somebody else? In other words, who are you to tell me what to do? We hear those kinds of questions. And then what about different cultures? That'll be brought up. Well, different cultures have different standards. Come on. Nobody can agree on what's right and wrong. Well, we're going to shoot that one down tonight. I'll show you in a few minutes. Here's another question. Can you be good without God? The answer is yeah, but we'll play with these ideas later on. So what I'm going to do now, I'm taking a lot of what I'm talking about either right from this book, which I mentioned the first week. It's called The God Conversation by J.P. Moreland. He says the best way you can get people to remember what you're talking about and react to it is to tell them examples or illustrations or stories. If you just, give them gaseous, nebulous, philosophical answers, that's gone the minute they walk away from you. But if you give them a visual, and so I'm going to be doing a lot of visuals tonight here. So you don't have to get the book, but it is good. I think I mentioned the first week, some of the examples are a little out of date, so I'm adding a few extras of my own here. So how about this? Imagine you're looking at the board at work, or you're looking in a want ad, something or other, and you see your job, the job you really would love to have is available. It's finally there for you. And you look at your resume and you think, well, it's not bad, but is it really going to stand out? So you could probably, they're not going to check on all this stuff, you could probably suggest that you did a little bit more than you really did. It's very tempting if that's the job you really want. So, of course, the question is, what do? Should you embellish it? Now, as you think about that, imagine that you have two bands, one band on one wrist, one band on the other. The one I think you're probably familiar with. Jesus. What's WWJD?
What would Jesus?
Yeah, what would Jesus do? Okay. But on the other wrist, you've got a band that says WWMD. Muhammad. Muhammad. Oh, man. Okay, I got that from a book that's out by a guy named Stanley Bing. Yeah, it's Machiavelli. Stanley Bing, I've read his stuff. He is just flat out funny. And he writes about, I guess he's been in the business world for a long time. So he writes columns, and then eventually they put the columns together and they'll create books out of this. So he's a best-selling author, and he's been long enough in the business world, he knows what's going on, and he has fun with it and exaggerates and pokes holes in what they do. So he's got a book out, it's a big bestseller. What would Machiavelli do? You notice it's a shark in the water. That gives you an idea of what this other band would indicate. So here's some of the quotes. What would Machiavelli do? This is what Bing says. To get ahead in the business world, he would feast on other people's discord, right? Set them against each other and play off of that. He'd realize that loving yourself means never having to say you're sorry. You remember that old movie, Love Story? Love is never having to say you're sorry. I thought that's the dumbest piece of advice. But anyway, so he'd fire his own mother if necessary. Sorry, Mom. He would establish a psychotic level of control. You know, Machiavelli was that guy that wrote The Prince and talked about how you get into power and stay in power. Better to be feared than loved. That's Machiavelli. So here's what he had to, he would make you fear for your life. But here's the part I wanted to get back to. Remember, we're talking about lying and kind of embellishing your resume. So here's Bing talking about lying from his book. He says, the list of accomplished liars is long and impressive. It would be easier to name those who did not lie when it became necessary. Those who do not lie do not succeed, and therefore remain unknown. Doesn't take long, does it? When you think about politics or you think about all sorts of things, you can come up with these lists of liars. It's amazing. It's hard to think about people who've kept their word and actually done the things they said they've done. So that's Bing. So let's go back to this dream job thing. So let's say you don't lie. You just make that resume what really happened, the exact number of hours and days and everything. You turn it in. And here's the bad news. There's a guy that's boasting in the next cubicle who says, man, I've really improved myself on paper. And so he's a liar, and you know it, and because he's been willing to boast about it around the water hole there. So you confront the person, you say, hey, come on, that wasn't right. Lying is wrong. It's not the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. And what do you suppose his response is going to be? So what? He just disagrees. Hey, I'm doing it for a good purpose. I'm going to get a good job, and I'm making money. I'm taking care of my family, or whatever it is. He's not going to say I'm doing it for evil purposes. Nobody ever does evil things. It's the way they're going to justify it. So this person disagrees with you. So now what? You say it was a bad thing to do. He says, no, it isn't. So do you flip a coin? I mean, how do you decide? Josh McDowell said this. Before you can disagree, so imagine the two of you sitting there. Before you can disagree with anyone about anything, the two of you have to agree on what? A standard. A standard of what's right and wrong. So I want to play on that a little bit. Here's my example. Suppose we're at church one Sunday and I run into a friend who says, hey, I want you to meet somebody new. You don't know him. You guys might get along real well. We start talking and he says, I like bowling. I say, I do too. Let's go bowling sometime. So he says, yeah, that sounds good. So the two of us go off. Do they have any bowling alleys around here anymore? Is Eagle Lane's the only one left, San Marcos? Oh man, I grew up with two in Escondido. Yeah, long gone. So we go over to Eagle Bowl, and I look at that first frame, and I throw the ball, and I knock 7 down. Second ball, I knock 2 more, and I'm not, that's okay. So I put my 9 down, sit back, it's his turn. He gets up, he throws the ball down, it goes in the gutter, and I'm kind of snickering to myself, I'm going to take this guy. And he comes back really excited. And I look over because he's going to mark the scorecard, and he puts down 20. And I say, wait a minute. You don't get 20 for guttering the thing. He says, yeah, you do. Well, now how are we going to decide what's right? Because we're disagreeing about something. It's not a moral issue, but it's an issue where apparently he has some standards that are not my standards and vice versa. So what do? We walk up to the main area there where they're renting all the equipment. What do? Find out the rules. Either they've got a booklet there, or you find somebody who's an expert that'll tell you, and then you say, okay, we agree, right? There's the standard out there. It wasn't my standard. It wasn't his standard. We'll find out what the actual standard is, and then we'll abide by that. And I'm going to erase that 20 as fast as I can. I don't want him to get 20 points. This is one of my favorite stories. I love this one. I don't know if it's true or not. It may be just a made-up story, but it sure illustrates the point. A kid is in a philosophy class, and he feels that morality is kind of relative. You make it up as you go. It's whatever you want. The individual gets to decide, and he writes this paper, and he turns it into the professor. Okay, everything's relative. When it's returned to him, it has a D- on it. And he's horrified, and he sets up a time. Can I come see you in your office? Sure. So he comes in, and he starts complaining. He says, hey, wait a minute. Didn't it have the right word count, minimum of 3 pages, 750 words? Yeah. Didn't I give credit to my sources? Yeah. Didn't I set that up in the correct format? Yeah. Didn't I use Times New Roman, 12-point font? Yeah. Did I double space? Yeah. It's on good paper? Yeah. Well, why did I get a D-? And the professor looks at him, he looks at the paper, and said, you put it in a blue folder. And the kid says, what? And the professor said, I don't like blue. That's my standard. Now, do you see the problem there? Right? The kid's got one standard, and the professor didn't really do it. I mean, he gave him a good grade. But, I mean, it's bringing up this whole thing about relativism. You can live and die by relativism. You know, you have your standard, but somebody else has their standards. Now what? What do you do? Okay, so let's start with the definition. Steve already covered this last week, so I'm not going to take much time on. But what's a moral absolute? That there are some actions that are just wrong for everybody, all time, all places. Whether anybody or even the whole culture, whether they believe it's morally right or not, they're out there. I mean, those things are truly right or truly wrong. And we discover these truths. We don't make them up. They're not fictions that we sit down and say, well, for this next 6 months, this will be right, and then after that we'll make it right. I mean, we don't do that kind of stuff. It's out there. It's already woven into the universe. And our job is to discover those things. So how about some examples? Two people are on a desert island. I told you I'd be doing a lot of examples here, illustrations. So two people are on a desert island, and they're not getting picked up. It's way off the beaten path. There aren't any ships going by. And after a few months, one of the persons looks at the other person sitting there going, I'd have a lot more food, and I'd have a lot more peace and quiet. This guy snores, and he's driving me nuts. So he takes a 2x4, and takes care of the guy. Now, nobody knows about it. Is that action wrong or right? It's still wrong. It's still murder, even though nobody else knew about it. Or maybe there's this illustration, if you like this one. Germany wins World War II. And they go out and they set up their schools, and they have a lot of propaganda going 24 hours a day, and they brainwash everybody in the entire world, let's say, to believe that murdering the Jews was not wrong. So step back from that. Was murdering the Jews wrong? Sure. Absolutely. Even though the whole world has bought into it and is nodding their head, it's okay, you can do it. But we say, no, it doesn't matter how many people are buying into it or not buying into it. If they're moral absolutes, these two events are wrong, still wrong. What you might do, this might be interesting, is if you got somebody who's a relativist, have two pieces of paper and say, let's do a not to be tolerated list. Things that you think are absolutely terrible. So I'm just curious for the class here, what do you think? What things come to mind that you say, nah, it's always wrong?
Sex trafficking.
Sex trafficking.
Murdering children.
What else?
Murder.
Murder.
Thievery.
Thievery.
Child abuse.
Child abuse. So my guess is, your friend will be writing these things down. You write your list down. Think of stories. I mean, all you have to do, Steve's already touched on it, all you have to do is open the newspaper, watch the television. It doesn't take long before you're gut punched with something that's just awful that's there. You've got the Ukraine battle, it continues. We've got school shootings. We've got now Hamas copying the ISIS method of terror, not just killing, but terrible things. Lynchings. And everybody believes those things are wrong. It doesn't matter whether somebody tries to justify them or not. So you got your list and you got your friend's list. I want to show you some examples of people that you might not think of as, they're not Christians, but they are, just because God's built into us. They said eternity is built into our hearts. I mean, we know that certain things are right and wrong. So Alan Dershowitz, pretty well-known guy, pretty much a leftist. And you know the story about him, I'll skip on. He has his own not to be tolerated list, so I'll share it with you. Here's what he had to say one time. We know what absolute evil is. So he's using that word evil. That's interesting. He says we've seen it. He says secularism, Nazism. He says atheism, communism. He says even in religion, the Inquisition, the Crusades. We know what evil is. We know what wrong is. So he's on our side. He says there is absolute evil out there. Let me share one other person with you, the director of Amnesty International that goes around trying to help people that are being imprisoned unfairly. He said, he was sending out a letter to everybody. I think you share my profound belief that there are indeed some moral absolutes. There we go. And he gave his own, that's his list, torture, government-sanctioned murder. We get a lot of South America, disappearances, people that object to the government, all of a sudden they're not around anymore. So he believes that there's such a thing as a not to be tolerated list as well. So you sit down with your friend. You've each done this on your own, and you're probably going to find a lot of them in common. I bet some of the ones we just talked about in here are going to be on both lists. But here's the key question that you can ask the person after you look back and forth. What standard are you using to call that thing immoral? What's your standard? We're back to that. We're going to keep coming back to that. I think that's the key takeaway for tonight is, what's your standard? If it's not God, now what? Because a lot of people don't think there's a God. Okay, then if that's not the standard, where are you going to get your standard? Arthur Leff wrote a really interesting piece several years back. He was a Yale law professor, not a Christian. He said, it'd be nice if there was a God out there that gave us rights and wrongs and we could follow that. He said, but I don't think there is, which is sad. So he says, all right, so now we've got to come up with some way to get our rights and wrongs. How do we do that? So he gave some examples from the past. He said, well, it used to be command of the sovereign, King Henry VIII. Okay, so whatever the king said, you just snapped to, and then that made it okay. Well, did that work real well? No. What's that?
Not for his wife.
Not for his wife, yeah. Then maybe democracy is okay. Does that work well? The majority of your voters? How did Hitler get to power? The voters. They voted him in. It was no coup. So a majority put him in. So that doesn't always work. And this is what Leff is pointing out. We've tried all these other systems. I'll give you two more in a minute. But we've tried all these other systems, having God out of the picture. Okay, will this work? No. Here's the third one. Does it work? Is it efficient?
What is that?
Utility means it works, it's efficient.
Oh.
So something like Hitler's Germany, did it work for a majority of the people? Yeah, up until the war. I mean, the trains ran on time.
Yeah, they had cars.
They had cars, and the standard of living was rising. So for most of the people, yeah, that was a principle of utility. Bob?
You know who taught Hitler how to set up an assembly line for the Volkswagen?
Henry Ford.
Henry Ford?
Ford.
Yeah, he's a real anti-Semite from what I heard.
Well, that was before the war.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe we should depend on what the Supreme Court says.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I'll just leave that one alone. You guys are already... 2 words, Dred Scott. Remember that from the 1800s? They decided slaves wouldn't have any rights. That was in this country, not somewhere else. So Supreme Court, 9 people. Do they always make perfect decisions? Absolutely not. They're human. So what does he conclude after he's run through all these other options, all these other possibilities? If there's no God, he's really discouraged. He says all of these things fail what he calls the great says who question. Because you tell somebody, well, the Supreme Court says we need to do such and such. So? Says who? Who cares what the Supreme Court says? And then he concludes, I thought this was really powerful, so I'm going to let you see this. This is his last part of his essay. Neither reason, nor love, nor even terror seems to have worked to make us good. Everything's up for grabs. Remember, he doesn't believe in a God. But look how he has to end this, because he has eternity in his heart. He says, nevertheless, napalming babies is bad, starving the poor is wicked, buying and selling each other is depraved. There is in the world such a thing as evil. And he had the bracket. He says, altogether now, says who? God help us. Which is a pretty ironic thing to say, considering he doesn't believe in a God, but he knows it would be better if there was a God. He says, look what we've tried, look what we've done, nothing works. We still do these terrible things to each other, and we know down deep in our gut that is wrong. But we can't say it because there's no God, there's no standard. Here's another illustration. You're walking down the street and you come across a wallet, got a lot of money in it. You're going, what to do, what to do? Now you might look to the elite of your society, let them tell you what the right thing is to do. I'll give you an example in a minute why this doesn't necessarily work well. Maybe you look to the whole culture that you grew up in, mom and dad and school and mass media and all that kind of stuff. Maybe it should be just up to the individual. You get to decide. What's the fourth option? God. Right? Standard beyond our culture, beyond us as individuals. So he said, those are basically your 4 options. So in the book there, they said, all right, let's use this. Let's use a real illustration for this. Let's take the Holocaust, because that's always so gripping. It's a real good thing to talk about. So should the elite and the powerful of Germany made the decision regarding the Holocaust? Well, what did they decide? The elite and the powerful were the Nazis. You're going to let them decide? That didn't turn out so well. Well, maybe it should be the German culture. They were anti-Semitic. So you're going to allow them to determine what to do with the Holocaust? Should they be in charge? What about the individual, Adolf Hitler? Well, you don't want to let him be the decision maker for what's right and what's wrong. Do you remember they had trials at the end of the war? They took the Germans that survived, the high-ups. You had 8 or 10 of them. There was Goering and Hess and some of the others. So they put them on trial, and they almost messed it all up. Because what happened, how do you find these people guilty? Seems pretty obvious. They're the ones that ordered the camps. They're the ones that put the people in the camps. They're the ones that sent out the squads to beat up anybody that didn't agree with them. Seems like it would have been a slam dunk. But the defense for the Germans was, hey, this is what our culture decided was right and wrong, and then you come in as winners at the point of a gun and tell us what we're doing is wrong. You can't do that. It's that says who question again. Do you see that? Who are you? You're in the American culture, you're in the British culture, you're in the Russian culture, you guys won the war, you're in the French culture, and we're the German culture. We got all these different cultures. You got a lot of nerve. Just because you blasted us doesn't mean your morality's any better. We have our morality, you have yours. The only way they got around that and hanged some of them, they said there's a law above the cultural law. They call it nature's law, but guess where they're talking about? They're talking about God. Something transcendent beyond us, beyond the human race, beyond Germany, beyond France, beyond Japan, whatever it was. There's some kind of bigger law in effect, and you guys broke that law. You didn't break the German law, but you broke this law above the law. And that's how they got them. Otherwise they wouldn't. They would have walked. So a lot of people say, well, trying to decide, it's so hard to decide some of these things. Yeah, but we all have moral intuitions. Now I'll give you an illustration of one that's not a moral intuition. And in other words, there are some things that, truths that you don't need to sit down with a book and open a book. You don't have to have it proved to you in a class. You don't have to do principles or anything like that. There's some things that you just know. I'll give you an example. You can get this one really easily. If Mary is taller than Jim, Jim's taller than Ann, what's the relationship between Mary and Ann? Who's taller? Mary's taller. Now, you didn't have to have a book. You didn't have to bring in cutouts, right? You didn't have to have a lesson in this. It's just, you go, well, it's just obvious. If one's taller than this one, but that one's taller than that one, then, right, the first one's got to be taller than the third one. It's just, that's the way it works. But that's not a moral issue, right? I'm just saying there are things that you just intuit. You just pick up on it. You didn't have to be taught. Here's one, right from our own founding document, the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be what? Self-evident. Self-evident. In other words, what are they saying? We don't have to prove it. We're not going to sit here and prove to you that these are the right things. These are the right things. You know it. Now, what they didn't say there, but I think they believed, because most of them are God-fearing people, they thought that we had eternity in us, right? Set in us by God. We didn't need, God gave us a mind, and we can use this mind to figure these things out. So, oops, got cut off a little bit. But we don't have to prove some of these not to be tolerated things are wrong. Why would we have to prove that? We just know that torturing for babies for fun is wrong. We don't have to say why, and we don't have to pull out books and excerpts, and we don't have to go to sources. People just know that kind of stuff.
Okay. So there's a fancy word to describe that. It's called axiomatic. An axiom is a truism that you don't have to explain.
Yeah.
You shouldn't have to explain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so you say, yeah, this is evident without having to give a justification for it. we refer to that as axiomatic.
Yeah.
It's kind of a helpful word to
That's a good
use
word.
with the intellectuals to say, I don't have to explain this, or I shouldn't have to explain this, because it is self-evident.
Right.
Yeah, Kokol says if anybody disagrees on something like torturing babies is fun, it says get help. Right? You've got a problem. It's not that we need to argue these things. You're something really warped badly inside you. But up comes this issue, though. But wait a minute. If everybody has this thing planted in us from God, how come all these cultures are so different? Well, here's the main point. They're not. They're not that different. They just did a study, I don't think it was a couple of years back, Oxford University, not a Christian university. And they took a bunch of anthropologists, they looked at 60 societies all over the world. What we would consider third world, second, first world, all across the world. They looked at their language, they looked at their output of material, and they tried to figure out, are there morals that they all share, or are we really that independent the way a lot of people want to tell us today? They found cultures are really alike in their moral teachings. I'll show you in just a second. And here was a conclusion. This is word for word from that. Everyone everywhere shares a common moral code. Now, they didn't put this in, I put that. Ecclesiastes 3, take a look at it. It says, God implanted in us eternity. He put eternity in our hearts. Yeah. We are God-shaped in a sense, right? There's a moral fiber to us that's not there maybe in the other animals. But that's what they're saying here. And here we go. They came up with 7 moral rules that they said all cultures share in these things. So I'll list them here, but I'm just curious. Do you have any ideas, any thoughts about what might be universal moral ideas?
Murder's wrong.
Murder, thievery, adultery. It's funny, that didn't make the list. Stealing, yeah. Well, here we go. Help your family. There's no society, apparently, on the earth that says it's a good idea to mess with the people in your family and sell them off and murder them and stuff like that. Help your group. So bigger than the family, whatever group size that happens to be, but you owe yourself to doing better things for your whole group. Return favors. Somebody does something nice for you, you should be doing something nice for them. Be brave. There's no society apparently on earth that says cowardly is the way to go. Right? Be brave. Defer to superiors. Divide resources fairly. And the last one is respect others' property. What?
5 and 6 jump out at me because defer to superiors smacks of fascism, but divide resources fairly smacks of communism.
The word fairly depends how we define fairly, doesn't it? But I thought this is interesting. Even if maybe we don't personally agree with all these, but that's what they're finding, that there are way more ways that we're the same as far as our moral attitudes go. Bridget?
It's interesting, I think about something that I learned in philosophy class in college, and they were trying to determine, like, how do you determine what is morally right? And they came up with this standard that if you did something and then you said, everybody in the world does this, would it be beneficial to society or detrimental to society? And that's how you determine what is right or wrong. For example, like, if you said homosexuality is right and everybody in the world was homosexual, it would ultimately destroy our society. So if you kind of think about that, it's logical, it's reasonable that the behavior that you are trying to defend or judge or justify, if you say everyone does that, does it destroy society or does it build it up? And it's what God does, is that everything he does is constructive and building.
Yeah. Beneficial.
And Satan, everything he does is destructive and unravels human life.
Yeah.
So it kind of helped me to understand,
That's interesting.
you know.
Yeah.
Also, that's where the utilitarian argument breaks down. You say, well, this is good, the best good for the most people.
Oh.
What if that happens, it takes place on the backs of the minority, like in
Heavy.
slavery?
Yeah.
That you've got a minority, yeah, it works great for the bulk of the population, but it comes at a cost of the minority.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you took that and said, everyone is a slave,
Yeah.
well, then where are we? We're destroyed. So,
Now, people may give you some blowback on this and say, well, wait a minute, cultures aren't doing all of those 7 things. And the Christian view is, yeah, of course not. First of all, where are these people getting this idea that we should be living this way? We're back to that eternity in the heart. And God gave us free will. He thinks that's so important that we're allowed to mess up and take advantage of other people, unfortunately, because we have free will. And we're messed up because of the fall. That's a Judeo-Christian view. So we're not surprised by the fact that people don't live up to these wonderful statements. It's because we're all broken individuals. It explains our feelings of guilt, by the way, as well. So some people, of course, here's a guy pretty well known, Robert Wright, popular book. Maybe evolution gave us morals. Right? So how does that work? So here's his idea. If you're going to survive as an animal, you got to adapt. Things change. The climate changes or something changes, the population increases or whatever. So animals want to survive, and so they have to adapt. And through natural selection, you get the changes start happening, and certain behavior patterns will allow a species to continue to exist. So if a species was real selfish and didn't share, then maybe tough times would come and there wasn't enough food, and so a lot of the animals would die off, and so they needed to be more kind to each other, right? So there's the idea of species want to exist, and if they do moral things, they will exist. And they call those patterns, he says, morality. That's morality. It's evolution's attempt to get us to keep going and not die out. But you know what's interesting is, look at his words. I want you to think about what he is saying and how he's saying it to show that he's got eternity in his heart and he's not really on board with evolution. I mean, just think what he says. Human beings are a species splendid in their array of moral equipment, tragic in their propensity to misuse it, and pathetic in their constitutional ignorance of the misuse. What's he doing?
yeah, he's saying there's morals.
And he's got a standard out there, and he says, look at the human race. We're not matching up to this standard. So you go, well, wait a minute. So he's got some kind of standard by which he's judging the human race. Why would he do that? If evolution just works, why would you care about using words like splendid or tragic or pathetic if you just say it works?
Misuse.
We're here, aren't we? We stomped on a lot of other species to get here. It works. But he uses words like tragic and pathetic. Or here's another part of his book. Go above. Now this is what we ought to do. Go above and beyond the call of a smoothly functioning conscience. Help those who aren't likely to help you in return, and do so when nobody's watching. This is one way to be a truly moral animal. Yeah, but look what he's doing here. He's telling you and he's telling me what we ought to do. Where's this ought coming from? Right? Does that help us survive into the next generation? Help those that aren't going to help me? Really? Why would I do that? I want to get the help. Why would I want to be kind to other people? Give me. I want stuff. So I think it's really interesting. He's arguing actually for the opposite of what his book says. What do you say about social Darwinism? The idea that in society you step on groups, to get your way, claw your way to the top. Survival of the fittest for our whole society. He says natural selection's indifference to the suffering of the weak is not something we need to emulate, nor should we care whether murder, robbery, and rape are in some sense natural. Well, of course it is. On an evolutionary scale, it is natural. One animal kills another animal. Oh well, that's the way it goes. It's for us to decide how abhorrent we find such things and how hard we want to fight them. Do you see that key word there again? It's abhorrent. It's not abhorrent for a lion to take down a gazelle. That's just the way the world works. Why can't we take down lesser races? Right? They're in our way. They're not as developed. They don't have as much education. They don't have as much money. I can step on them. That's evolution. But he's fighting that. Even though in the book it says it's evolution that's got us where we are today. Why not copy nature and destroy the weak? That's what goes on out there. Evolution doesn't provide any reason why we can't do that. It has no ought. In fact, you can think of it this way. Why should I be moral tomorrow? Evolution doesn't give you an answer to that. Why should I be moral tomorrow? Why are you imposing an ought on me? Says who? We're back to that question again. Morality dictates what you're going to do in the future. It has that ought quality to it. And you can't get an ought from evolution. You can look back and say this is what happened, but you can't say, and therefore this is right or this is wrong. So Darwinism just tries to tell you what it was like in the past. Okay, this is starting to wrap up here. Anybody know who Brian Godawa is? Steve does. Okay, he's a filmmaker, a Christian filmmaker, a Christian writer. He's written novels and all. He wrote I guess they do the screenplay for To End All Wars.
Yes, I've got the DVD.
Okay. It's a powerful movie. I mean, it got good reviews and everything. So this guy is very, very sharp when it comes to filmmaking. Thank goodness there are a few good Christians out there who are producing some good material. So he's got this YouTube video. It's only about a 7 or 8 minute movie that you can access. I'll just warn you, it's kind of grim, and I'll use the word disturbing. It's disturbing. I'll show you why in just a second. I'm not going to show the film. I'm just going to give you part of the dialogue. But if you want to go see it, take a look, because it's put together really well, but it's chilling to watch. So here's the setup. It starts with, there's kind of a dark room, and you see a guy up close, and he's kind of opening his eyes as if he's been knocked out or something. He's got tape across his mouth, and he looks down, and he can't move his arms because he's tied to a chair. And he glances over here, and there's a tray full of very sharp objects. And then this guy comes out of the dark to him. And the guy says, I heard your talk. You're a professor. You believe morality is just DNA. It's just evolution. It's something that just happens. It's relative to the individual. It's relative to the society. I heard you say all of that stuff. You're in a bad spot here, my friend. Give me a reason why I shouldn't kill you. And the professor, first off, just says, don't kill me. He says, okay, give me one good reason. He starts walking over to the instruments there. And he says, it's illegal. Murder is illegal. You'll go to jail. Now, what would a relativist's response be?
Who's going to catch me?
What?
Who's going to catch me?
Yeah. He says, I don't plan on being caught. There goes that argument. So he's trying to instill fear. You know, that's why you should be moral, because you got to fear. You know, the police will get you, or your wife will catch you doing, you know, adulterous thing, or whatever it is. So basis of fear, and he's going, I won't get caught. So there goes that, right? So there goes a prop trying to hold up this guy's morality. So the professor tries another route, but it's wrong to kill. Do you think that would have changed the relativist? No. He says, well, you said our DNA determines our behavior. DNA doesn't have any morality. Okay, now he's in trouble, deeper trouble. It's abnormal. Your DNA is pointing at, well, he can't point, but he's talking to the killer, potential killer. He says, your DNA is abnormal. He says, well, abnormality has to do with statistical averages, not right and wrong. You're normal on a scale, but that's not a scale of morality. So this guy's really sweating bullets at this point. Well, society agrees. Now we're to the idea, remember, does your society determine right and wrong? Society agrees killing is wrong. This guy says society is another word for statistical average. That doesn't make it right. Doesn't make it wrong. Our species won't survive if we allow killing. Kind of the evolution argument again. You know, our species won't survive. What do you think his response is? You won't survive. I will. Now, you know, it's kind of funny here, but I'm warning you one more time. It's not pleasant to watch because he's got a taser and he's, you know, anyway. So you watch this thing and your stomach starts to tighten because you're kind of rooting for this guy to come up with some reason to save his life. He has no good reason. because he's a relativist. He can't say there's a God out there who's going to judge you for what you're doing. So he's coming up with all the society says, and you're going to get caught. You know, you ought to worry about it. The guy's going, I'm not worried. So anyway, let's do this, because I want to save a little time if you have questions. I'm not going to go through this in depth. I'm just going to rattle these things off, but I'll give you an outline that lists it, okay? Because I think, Steve and I have spent 2 weeks on this. I think we've accumulated a pretty darn good list of the problems with relativism that we're stuck with in this society. You can't say Hitler was wrong. If you're in Germany and you oppose Hitler, that's what the society wanted. That makes you immoral because you're going against your society. All the great moral teachers of history have agreed relativism is a bad idea. And we're not talking just Judeo-Christian. You got Buddha in there, you got Gandhi in there. They all agree relativism is not the way to go. Think about this. Who's the hero of nonviolence? Probably Gandhi. Right? You'd put him up as the primary person. Who's the hero for helping the poor? Yeah, everybody thinks maybe Mother Teresa. So who's the hero of moral relativism? In other words, pays no attention to what anybody else says is right or wrong. Kind of marches to the beat of his own drum. You know what that is? That's called a sociopath. If that's your best person, if that's your representative, that's tough, right? I mean, that's not a good person to have out there. It can't be lived. Just step in front of somebody in line, and they'll say, hey, you shouldn't do that. Now, if they're a relativist, they shouldn't have said that. They can't use words like ought or should or shouldn't. It's really not an ethical system. I mean, the moral relativist is just a person without morals at all, just deciding what I want to do. So it's not even considered an ethical system. Moral words don't have any meaning to a relativist. What's rape to him? I don't know. He gets to decide what the definition of that is, or murder, or honesty, or courage. There's no such thing as an immoral law. If it's passed, that's what your society wants, that's okay then. There are no moral reformers. There's no moral progress. You could change a society, but you're not getting necessarily better, because now you got a standard out there again. You can't accuse others of wrongdoing, right? Because they'll say, who are you? Says who? You can't place blame or accept praise. You can't improve somebody's morality. You could change it, but you can't improve it. You can't promote an obligation of tolerance. Our whole society is big on tolerance. You can say, why? Why should we be tolerant? Because it's right. What, your definition of right? You can't be proscriptive. You can't use words like should and ought. That Arthur Leff article, where are we going to get that standard? We've tried other standards and it hasn't worked for our society. But the biggest problem of all, and if you don't take away anything else from tonight, the biggest problem comes back to what we both have talked about the last 2 weeks, that there is evil in the world. Everybody knows that. We've got that built-in God part of us. We look at these things that we see in the news today and in the past years, we say, that's wrong. That's just absolutely wrong, whatever it is. But a moral relativist can't complain about these things and call them good or call them evil, can they? All they can say is, I don't like it. Well, what kind of standard is that? People being butchered in the streets of Israel, and you just go, ooh? No, you say, that's evil. Are you hearing that word evil, by the way? I'm hearing that a lot now. Yeah, that finally woke some people up. I was glad to actually hear that word evil, not just, well, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter or something. No, they're going, no, that's evil. Okay, here's the last thought of the night. This is a person, again, not a Christian, named Paul Kurtz, talking about moral and ethical principles. He said, if they aren't derived from God or anchored in something that's transcendent beyond the human race, are they purely ephemeral, meaning short-lived? And I think the answer is yes. Because what we have today will not be the same tomorrow if it's not anchored in something that's eternal. We've seen that in our society. What was considered good a few years ago is not considered good anymore. And it'll keep changing. The ground's going to be quicksand. It's going to be shifting all the time. I think he's exactly right.